The first time I saw that sign, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because my brain refused to process the level of audacity standing in the middle of my own dirt road. A bright, freshly painted wooden sign, sunk into concrete like it had every right in the world to be there, reading, "Welcome to Pine Ridge, private HOA community." On my land. On land my great-grandfather bled into with his bare hands in 1912. I remember sitting there in my truck, engine idling, dust drifting through the sunlight, thinking either I've finally lost my mind or somebody just tried to annex 112 acres of Arizona history while I was grading papers. See, I'm a history professor during the week. I spend my days talking about the Homestead Act, land grants, the Gadsden Purchase, how borders shift, and power rewrites maps. Then on weekends, I drive up to the Baylor homestead. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal half the time, just scrub pine, rattlesnakes, and the old stone house my great-grandfather built from rock he hauled up from the dry wash behind the ridge. That house has stood longer than most of Prescott's downtown buildings. It survived dust storms, freezes, droughts, and 3 generations of Baylor stubbornness. It was never part of any subdivision, never under anyone's community guidelines. It was sanctuary, mine. So when I saw that sign, I told myself it had to be a mistake. Maybe some overambitious developer down the mountain misread a map. Simple clerical error. Happens all the time, right? Except the deeper I drove, the less simple it felt. The road had been regraded. Reflective stakes lined the curves. New black metal mailboxes stood on a fresh gravel turnout. One of them stamped Baylor. No one had asked me. No one had given me a key. And just before my gate, a little nylon flag with a pine tree logo fluttered in a berm I had cleared myself last summer with a pickaxe and a bottle of Gatorade. That's when my phone rang. Private number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Mr. Baylor," a woman's voice said, polished, rehearsed, the kind of tone that's sweet until it isn't. "This is Karen Langford, president of Pine Ridge Estates, HOA. I believe you're currently visiting property that now falls under our jurisdiction." Visiting? I almost choked. "Ma'am," I said carefully, "this property's been in my family for over 100 years. She actually chuckled, like I confused a broom closet for Narnia. "We've reviewed historical cadastral maps from 1948, she continued. "It appears your parcel boundaries were never properly recorded. We've designated the area provisional community space under our new charter." Provisional? On my great-grandfather's land patent. I hung up before I said something that would have made my department chair blush. That night, I pulled their little flag out of the ground and tossed it in my fire pit. I left the sign standing. I wanted them to see it when they came back. I had a feeling this wasn't over. I was right. The following Friday, I drove up with masonry tools to patch the barn wall and found a steel gate across my access road. Bright silver. Fresh concrete posts. Keypad blinking red like it was daring me to try. Above it, private road. Pine Ridge, HOA enforcement. They'd locked me out of my own land. I stood there in the heat, hands on my hips, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I called the county utilities office. After 20 minutes on hold, a woman told me the road had been listed as part of a managed easement under dispute. They had petitioned to control my driveway. I hiked 2 miles through the ridge that afternoon, camera in hand, documenting everything. When I reached my house, an orange notice was taped to the front door. Occupancy suspended. HOA enforcement. They had cut the power, too. Professionally disconnected. I slept in my truck that night, staring at the stars through the windshield, thinking about my grandfather's hands mixing mortar in the moonlight a century ago, and how some HOA president thought she could slap a sticker on that and call it community management. That was the moment the anger crystallized into something colder. This wasn't confusion. It was theft. By 8 a.m. the next morning, I was hunched over microfilm at the Yavapai County Records office. I found the original 1911 Homestead patent signed under federal authority. Hand-drawn boundary lines that matched modern GPS coordinates exactly. Tax payments every single year since 1912. Continuous ownership. No gaps. No disputes. I scanned everything. Backed it up 3 times. That's when Roberta at the archive desk leaned over and said quietly, You're not the first person they've tried this on. That changed everything. By noon, I was sitting across from Susan Lerner, Silver Braid, Courtroom Shark. She reviewed my file and muttered, "Well, they picked the wrong cowboy." Within hours, she filed a temporary restraining order. By sunset, a sheriff's deputy was photographing the gate and the orange tag on my door. But the real twist came in court. Karen's lawyer presented a 1948 zoning map, supposedly proving my land fell within Phase 1 of Pine Ridge Estates. The judge flipped through it. Then she frowned. "This pond shown here," she said, tapping the page, "was constructed in 1983 according to county water records." Silence. Susan rose like she'd been waiting her whole life for that moment. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "GIS metadata embedded in this PDF shows it was created in 2021 using ArcGIS Pro. Author tag, Cliff Landers, brother of a Pine Ridge board member." You could hear oxygen leave the room. Fraud. Court-ordered forensic review followed. That's when an HOA insider, a jittery IT guy named Drew, anonymously sent us internal emails. One line from Karen hit like a sledgehammer. "We need this locked in before anyone from the Baylor family notices. Get Cliff to modify the old county map cleanly." They weren't confused. They were annexing. And they'd already drafted Phase 2 development plans. Luxury homes drawn right over my land. My barn labeled to be cleared. My house described as existing structure, demolition scheduled. It was done, on paper. Except now I had proof. What none of them anticipated was that their own greed would expose a bigger rot. The same county official who approved their temporary stewardship had quietly signed off on 6 other suspicious parcel reclassifications in the last 18 months, all tied to Pine Ridge, all routed through a shell company registered under Karen's brother. This was an HOA drama. It was organized land fraud. Arrests came on a quiet Friday morning. I was on my porch when Susan texted, "Turn on Channel 7. There was Karen, cream blazer, hands cuffed behind her back, reporters shouting questions she refused to answer. Right behind her, the county official who'd approved their filings. Conspiracy, forgery, attempted illegal seizure of private property, wire fraud. And here's the part that still makes me shake my head. Once her arrest hit the news, residents of Pine Ridge started auditing their own dues. Turns out she'd been siphoning maintenance contracts through her brother's companies, inflating costs, pocketing the difference. They weren't just stealing land. They were stealing from their own neighbors. The civil judgment came weeks later. Courtroom packed. Cameras everywhere. The judge didn't mince words. "You barricaded a man from his century-old registered property under false authority. That is organized theft. Full compensation awarded. $1.2 million. HOA operations suspended indefinitely pending audit and restructuring." And then, the part that meant more than the money. The Baylor Homestead was granted official historical preservation status under state protection. That land can never again be rezoned, annexed, or provisionally managed without state consent. When I walked out of that courthouse, a reporter shoved a microphone in my face and asked how I felt. I said, like I just punched 100 years of history back into place. But here's the thing. Somewhere in the middle of all this, sitting alone at my oak kitchen table after the power was restored, I realized something that hit harder than any courtroom win. Most people don't fight. Not because they don't care. Because they're tired, busy, intimidated by paperwork and authority and official-sounding language. Karen counted on that. She targeted ambiguous records, elderly owners, people who'd inherited land but didn't live on it full-time. She assumed history was too quiet to defend itself. The lesson wasn't about revenge. It was about vigilance. Power doesn't always kick your door down. Sometimes it shows up with a clipboard and a smile and says, "We're just clarifying boundaries." If I hadn't checked that microfilm, if I hadn't kept receipts, if I'd shrugged and thought, "It's just an HOA," that stone house would be gone. Last week, county workers installed a new hand-carved sign at my gate. It reads, "Baylor Homestead, established 1912. Private historical property, not part of any HOA." I stood there at dusk with a cold beer in my hand, watching the sun bleed orange over the ridge, and I swear I could almost hear my great-grandfather laughing. They try to plant their flag. Now, the only thing planted out there is a warning. So here's the question that's been rattling around in my head. Where's the line between community governance and organized overreach? At what point does neighborhood improvement turn into quiet theft dressed up in bylaws? Because if they'd succeeded here, how many other old homesteads would have disappeared without anyone noticing? I'm curious what you think. If someone tried to annex your land with paperwork and confidence alone, would you fight, or would you assume the system must be right? Tell me where you draw that line. And if you've ever gone toe-to-toe with an HOA or a local authority, I'd honestly like to hear it. History only survives when somebody's willing to stand in front of it and say no.